Before he dies, Bob Lazar finally reveals what was inside Area 51, and he has proof. An old man sits down in front of a camera, and for the first time in over 3 decades, he stops holding back. He is not young anymore. His hands are steadier from age, his voice is quieter, but the story he is about to tell is the same one that once made him fear for his life. Decades ago, he said he touched something that was not built by any nation on this planet. He said he watched it hover in dead silence, then vanish faster than the human eye could track. And for 30 years, half the world called him a liar while the other half called him the most important whistleblower of the modern age. Now older, and aware that time is no longer on his side, he says he is finally ready to show what he kept. Not just words this time. He claims to have proof. His name is Robert Scott Lazar, known to almost everyone simply as Bob Lazar. In the spring of 1989, he sat in front of a Las Vegas television camera with his face hidden in shadow and his voice deliberately altered, and he told a story that, if true, would represent one of the greatest secrets ever kept by the United States government. He said he had worked inside a hidden facility buried into a mountain in the Nevada desert, a place that officially did not exist. He said that inside that mountain were aircraft unlike anything human engineering had ever produced, and that his job had been to study how they flew. It was, and remains, an extraordinary claim. And extraordinary claims invite extraordinary scrutiny, which is exactly what Lazar has faced every single day since that broadcast aired. To understand why his story refuses to die, and why people are still talking about it decades later, you have to understand 2 things at once. You have to understand the case against him, because it is real and it is serious. And you have to understand the case for him, because it is stranger than most skeptics are comfortable admitting. Somewhere in the space between those 2 cases is where Bob Lazar has lived his entire adult life. He was born in 1959 in Coral Gables, Florida, a quiet, palm-lined suburb of Miami. By every account from people who knew him as a boy, he was not an ordinary child with an ordinary curiosity about how things worked. He was consumed by it. While other kids were content to take a radio apart and leave the pieces scattered across a bedroom floor, young Lazar took things apart and rebuilt them into something new. He was fascinated most of all by the physics of motion, by the idea that with the right combination of fuel, pressure, and design, an object could be made to leave the ground entirely. As a teenager, he built working rockets in his family's garage, machining nose cones and hacking propellant, launching them over the flat Florida landscape while neighbors watched somewhere between alarm and admiration. He didn't stop there. He built functioning jet engines by hand, and then, because building alone was never enough for him, he mounted them onto vehicles. Later in life, this obsession produced a jet-powered car that could reportedly hit speeds fast enough to make police reach for their radios, and a jet-powered bicycle he rode down public streets, trailing a visible plume of superheated exhaust. This was not a man who read about engineering from a textbook. This was a man who could not stop doing it with his own hands. That detail matters, because it shapes everything that follows. After high school, Lazar moved west to California and enrolled at Pierce College, a community college in the San Fernando Valley. This is where the story of his education becomes complicated and where his critics have built their strongest argument against him. Lazar would later claim to hold a master's degree in electronic technology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a master's degree in physics from the California Institute of Technology, 2 of the most respected scientific institutions in the world. When journalists and researchers went searching for confirmation, they found nothing. No enrollment records.
No transcripts.
No professors who remembered teaching him. Both institutions stated plainly that they had no evidence he had ever attended. For many people, that was the entire case against him, settled once and for all. A man who invents his own academic credentials is a man whose word cannot be trusted about anything, let alone something as extraordinary as alien spacecraft. Lazar's own explanation is that his records were deliberately erased as part of the same security process that later wiped away evidence of his work in the Nevada desert. It is, by any honest measure, a convenient explanation, the kind of unfalsifiable claim that a clever storyteller might reach for when caught in an inconsistency. Reasonable people are right to be skeptical of it on its own. But the picture becomes more complicated once you look past the missing university records and toward a different institution entirely, the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, the birthplace of the atomic bomb and one of the most secure scientific facilities in the country. Researchers have located a 1982 internal telephone directory from Los Alamos that lists a Robert Lazar as a staff technician. It is not the kind of document a private citizen could easily fabricate or plant. That same year, a local newspaper, the Los Alamos Monitor, published a feature story describing him as a physicist and photographing him beside the jet-powered car he had built, the same obsessive, hands-on engineering instinct from his Florida childhood now grown into something that could legally reach highway speeds. People who worked at the lab during that period have said in later years that they remember him. And yet, when journalists eventually pressed Los Alamos directly, the laboratory denied that he had ever been employed there. A name in an internal phone book, a newspaper description of him as a staff physicist, and an official denial that any of it happened. That contradiction has never been fully resolved in either direction, and it is precisely the kind of loose thread that has kept serious researchers from dismissing him outright, even when they remain unconvinced by his larger claims. It is somewhere inside that unresolved gap, Lazar says, that a phone call changed the direction of his life. Around 1988, he says he received a call from Dr. Edward Teller, the physicist widely remembered as the father of the hydrogen bomb and one of the most influential figures in the history of American weapons science. According to Lazar, the two had crossed paths briefly at Los Alamos years earlier, an almost accidental meeting outside the facility, when Teller noticed the young technician reading a newspaper article about himself and his jet car. A short conversation followed, the kind of small moment that means nothing at the time and everything in hindsight. Lazar says Teller remembered him, and that when the phone eventually rang with an offer of new work, he did not laugh it off. He listened. What followed, in Lazar's account, was a plunge into a level of secrecy far beyond anything in his previous work. He describes extensive interviews, fingerprinting, and pages of security agreements written in the kind of dense legal language designed to bind a person's silence permanently. He was told only that the work involved advanced propulsion systems, a phrase specific enough to sound official and vague enough to explain nothing. He was instructed to fly to Las Vegas, and from there he says he was taken somewhere that appeared on no official map. Most people know the name Area 51, the legendary test site associated with Cold War-era aircraft development. But Lazar has always maintained that his own destination was a separate facility roughly 15 miles south of the famous Groom Lake site, near a smaller, more obscure dry lake bed known as Papoose Lake. He calls this location S4. In his description, it was not a conventional building at all, but a structure built directly into the side of a mountain, with massive hangar doors textured and colored to blend seamlessly with the surrounding rock, invisible from the air or from any distance. He recalls being driven in on a bus with blacked-out windows so that workers could never map the route in their minds, and an atmosphere so tense that people avoided even casual conversation, understanding without being told that curiosity itself could be dangerous there. And then, he says, came the day that split his life into a clear before and after. He was led into a hangar and told to look. Resting on the floor in front of him was a disc roughly 40 feet across, its surface metallic and, most strikingly, completely seamless. There were no rivets, no welds, no bolts, nothing resembling the way any aircraft he had ever worked on had been assembled. It looked, he would later say, less like something manufactured and more like something grown. His first instinct, trained by a lifetime spent around machines, was that this had to be an exceptionally advanced human aircraft, some secret prototype built by American engineers so far ahead of anything publicly known that only a small circle would ever hear of it. That was the reasonable assumption, the assumption any skeptic would make walking in cold. It was also, according to Lazar, wrong. The briefing documents he says he was given did not describe a single prototype. They described a small fleet, 9 separate craft of varying shapes and sizes, each one catalogued in the flat, unemotional language typical of a government file. And that language, he insists, did not hedge. It stated directly that these objects were believed to be of extraterrestrial origin, some recovered from crash sites, others obtained through means the documents did not fully explain. Lazar says he read the words more than once, waiting for them to resolve into something ordinary. In his telling, they never did. The particular craft assigned to him, nicknamed the sport model by the small group of workers because of its sleek, compact shape, became the subject of his most detailed and most scrutinized testimony. He described a spherical reactor roughly the size of a basketball positioned near the center of the craft, powered by a substance that, in 1989, appeared nowhere on the periodic table. He called it element 115. According to his account, a stable form of this element, when bombarded with protons, would convert into element 116 and release energy through a controlled matter-antimatter reaction, an amount of energy far beyond anything achievable with conventional human technology. That energy, he claimed, was not used to generate thrust in any traditional sense. There was no combustion, no exhaust, no roar of engines. Instead, he described the craft as using the energy to bend the fabric of space itself, gravity amplifiers positioned around the lower rim of the disk directing the distortion and allowing the craft to move by essentially falling into a warped path in front of it. This, he argued, was why witnesses across decades and continents consistently reported the same signature behaviors, an ability to hover in total silence and then accelerate away in a way that would be lethal to a human pilot inside any conventional cockpit. For years, the scientific response to this account was understandably dismissal. Antimatter reactors of the kind he described did not exist in any laboratory. Controlled gravity manipulation had no basis in accepted physics. And element 115 itself was, at the time, a purely theoretical entry on the periodic table, unconfirmed and unsynthesized. To much of the scientific community, a man describing a fuel source that had never been created was simply describing fiction dressed up in technical language. Then, in 2003, a team of scientists working at a laboratory in Russia successfully synthesized element 115 for the first time, 14 years after Lazar had first spoken its name on television. Element 115, later officially named Moscovium, moved from theory into confirmed scientific fact. To his supporters, this felt like vindication, evidence that a man with no formal training in nuclear physics had somehow named a real, undiscovered element more than a decade before science caught up to him. To his critics, it was simply a coincidence, or an educated guess made by someone with enough scientific literacy to know that heavy, unstable elements near the upper end of the periodic table were a natural area of ongoing research. That disagreement has never fully settled, and it remains one of the most cited details in every discussion of his credibility, in both directions. Over the years, Lazar has pointed to a handful of physical items he says support parts of his account, including a W-2 tax form listing a Department of Naval Intelligence connection for the period he claims to have worked at S4, along with the photographs, newspaper clipping, and internal phone directory placing him at Los Alamos. None of these documents, on their own, prove the existence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. What they do complicate is the simplest version of the story his critics prefer, the version where he is nothing more than an uneducated fantasist who invented an elaborate hoax from nothing. The paper trail, incomplete and contradictory as it is, suggests a man who really did work in serious, classified scientific environments before he ever went in front of a camera. The personal cost of speaking out, if his account is accurate, was significant. He has described a break-in at his home, gunfire aimed at his vehicle on a desert highway, and threats serious enough to change how he lived his daily life. He was also arrested in an incident years later that he and his supporters have described as an attempt to discredit and silence him, a claim his critics reject entirely. Decades afterward, a federal raid targeted his business, which he came to believe was connected to his long-standing pursuit of the very element that started his story in the first place. Whatever the truth behind these events, they are consistent with the account of a man who believes, correctly or not, that he made powerful enemies by talking. For most of the years that followed his initial claims, Lazar mostly withdrew from public life. He built a legitimate scientific supply business, kept a low profile, and gave only occasional interviews that added little new detail, as though he considered the matter closed and was content to let history judge him, without further elaboration. But something has shifted in recent years, driven partly by his own advancing age and partly by a broader cultural shift he could never have predicted back in 1989. What was once dismissed instantly as science fiction is now the subject of official congressional hearings. The Pentagon has publicly acknowledged a program dedicated to investigating unidentified aerial phenomena. Footage captured by military pilots has been released and confirmed as authentic by the government itself, showing objects that reportedly perform maneuvers beyond the known capability of any aircraft on Earth. Senior former intelligence officials have testified under oath about programs studying materials and objects of unknown origin. None of this proves Lazar's specific claims about S4 or element 115. But it has fundamentally changed the atmosphere in which his story is heard. The premise that the government might secretly study objects that do not appear to be of human origin is no longer treated as automatically absurd the way it was on that shadowed broadcast in 1989. That shift appears to be part of why Lazar, now in his 60s, has begun speaking with more detail and less caution than at any point in the past 3 decades. Friends and researchers close to him describe a man who understands that the years ahead of him are far fewer than the years behind him, and who seems increasingly determined not to let his account disappear into the same silence that swallowed the records of his education and his time at Los Alamos. He has spoken more specifically about how the propulsion system he studied was believed to function, about the exact ways he says his employment history was scrubbed from official channels, and about materials he says he managed to preserve despite the immense legal and personal risk involved. He maintains that physical evidence exists, including documentation and, by his account, other materials connected to his time at S4, though independent verification of any of it remains, as it always has, elusive. It is worth being honest about where this story actually stands. Bob Lazar has never wavered from the core details of his account across more than 30 years of scrutiny, interviews, lawsuits, and investigations, which is unusual for a fabricated story sustained that long under that much pressure. At the same time, no independent scientist has ever confirmed the existence of the aircraft, the reactor, or the specific technology he describes, and the missing university records remain a legitimate and unresolved problem with his credibility. Both of these things are true at once, and that tension is exactly why his case has never been fully closed by either side. What makes Lazar's story genuinely different from most conspiracy narratives is its total lack of ambiguity. He does not describe a mystical experience or a vague feeling of being watched. He describes a job, a reactor, a fuel source, a propulsion mechanism with a stated method of operation. That specificity is either the mark of a man who saw something extraordinary and understood it well enough to explain the mechanics, or it is the mark of an unusually disciplined and technically literate storyteller who built a claim precise enough to survive 30 years of attempted debunking. Both possibilities remain on the table, and reasonable, well-informed people continue to land on opposite sides of that line. As official government acknowledgement of unexplained aerial phenomena continues to grow, Bob Lazar remains the same man he was in 1989 in one important respect. He has never asked to be believed unconditionally. He has simply continued to tell the same story, in more detail now than ever before, insisting that behind a mountainside door in the Nevada desert, something remains that the rest of the world has still never been allowed to see. Whether that is the shape of an elaborate, decades-long fabrication, or the shape of an uncomfortable truth that the world is only now catching up to, is a question that neither his supporters nor his critics have managed to settle. And as he grows older, with fewer years ahead of him than behind, that question may soon belong entirely to history rather than to the man who lived it.